Part 1 of this series on Landscape in the Mist had ended with a discussion of the philosophical underpinnings behind the scene and actions of Orestes, the young man who had bumped into Volo and Alexandros, where he finds the discarded film strip in the garbage heap in the streets at night. As one of the key scenes in the film, in fact a crucial scene to understand the motivation that drives the siblings, and especially its ambiguous ending, the importance of Orestes cannot be underestimated, despite his somewhat limited screen presence, at least when compared to the other two children in which the film focuses. In addition to the aforementioned moment, Orestes is present as well in what is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the film and perhaps the most iconic of the entire work, a truly astounding cinematic moment of lasting impression, which is when the young man sits brooding by the pier and a large rock hand appears to emerge from the bottom of the sea. Soon after, a military helicopter is seen approaching the location, and Orestes is joined by Volo and Alexandros, who seem just as bewildered as him by the appearance of this surviving piece from classical antiquity. Standing nearby are two men with bright yellow waterproof coats, a meta-element of Angelopoulos' oeuvre, which may be briefly glimpsed on another scene in the film, and which are met again, for example, in the suspended step of the stork or Eternity and the Day, representing a connection between different times or spaces, depending on the film context, and which shall have its meaning further examined on a future separate video. For now, it suffices to say that their presence signals the establishing of a bridge between present and past, and here one once again witnesses the seamless temporal weaving stitched by Angelopoulos in his work, disclosing the omnipresence and understanding of Greece's unavoidable and influential heritage. This sunken and forgotten piece of the past suddenly surfaces, and in its unexpected, sublime probity, it reveals itself as hypnotic, strikingly beautiful, utterly awe-inducing, aided undoubtedly by the always stirring music of Eleni Karindrou, a scene which finds similar iterations on the opening of the suspended step of the stork and in Ulysses' gaze. This prodigious hand is taken away soon after by the helicopter, and the trio of youths is forced to watch it recede into the distance. This mystifying, ephemeral scene of ethereal, almost surreal nature naturally invites the viewer to ponder and speculate once one finds oneself reminiscing of the viewing after the film has ended. Is Angelopoulos advising us, humanity, to let go of the past so as to proceed forward, unimpeded by a distant memory to which we have no direct relation, but one only inputted through intermediary people across centuries? Is he perhaps focusing specifically on the youth, here represented by Orestes, Volo and Alexandros, urging the younger generations in particular to avoid strapping themselves unyieldingly to the past, which may have been the cause of unfulfillment or angst for those that came before them? Or is he maybe warning us of the inevitable loss and ever-increasing distancing of the past, in a sense reassuring us of the natural progression of history and life? Regarding the past, here's what Angelopoulos had to say when interviewed by Dan Fainaru. My feeling is that the past is an integral part of the present. The past is not forgotten. It affects everything we do at the present. Every moment of our lives consists of the past and the present, the real and the imaginary, all of them blending together into one. Therefore, whatever the actual meaning behind this mesmerizing scene in particular, and even if conforming to an interpretation that hints at foregoing the attachment to the roots of a nation and its identity, it's unlikely that the viewer ought to take the scene as an indication to absolutely ignore the past entirely, for its fascination, ravishing power and beauty is bound to entice any observer, not to mention that the capacity to learn from it should be taken into account for any conscious individual. Indeed, one may nevertheless acknowledge the past and how it shaped the aspects of one's life, without having to rely on it dogmatically to project and structure its future. Angelopoulos had shared in another interview that the very first image he had in mind regarding the film that would eventually become Landscape in the Mist was of a city covered in fog and a hand that dissolved in it, revealing therefore the pictorial source for this magical image. However, in a different occasion, Angelopoulos stated that I couldn't really tell you the significance of the stone hand pulled out of the Thessaloniki harbor. The basic structure of the film, as I told you, was similar to a fairy tale, which gives you much greater freedom to introduce elements that are outside the logic of the plot. but one should not try to systematically unravel their meanings, for you risk losing the flow of the narrative. Therefore, much like in Andrei Tarkovsky's films, the Greek master's works are ripe with imagery that titillates a viewer's imagination and understanding, and which work in a scheme where the assorted scenes are wholly integrated, meaning that to have the individual images detached from their film context might cause them to lose both their logic and impact. Although it may be an intellectually gratifying exercise to ruminate on a film's possible meanings once the visualization of the work has ended, this should never get in the way of an uninterrupted experience of the film, at least not while it elapses. On a side note, the fairy tale inspiration and structure mentioned by Angelopoulos is of critical importance for the understanding of the film, and it shall be explored in another video, together with some other aspects. Still about Orestes, he introduces Vola to love. As the audience can tell, she quickly becomes infatuated with him in the film, something which ended up happening in real life too, as shared by Angelopoulos to one interviewer. The subject bears particular meaning for doubtless the first love is one of the defining moments in every person's life, but with it also comes the equally influential first contact with the disheartening throes of romantic deception, revealing a case of unrequited love as a matter of fact, which is grounded on Vola's witnessing of Orestes heading into a nightclub bathroom together with another young man after a brief chat, hinting at his homosexuality and therefore impossible romantic relationship with her. The following scene, which sees Vola taking Alexandros on a road at night somewhat hurriedly into a dark patch without road lights, is one of the most touching, poignant scenes in the film, as the children are joined shortly afterwards by a visibly worried Orestes on the bike, hoping to return the bag they left behind, and in an attempt to stop and convince them to return so that he might get them to the train station next morning, as he had promised earlier. Still, he soon acquiesces to their departure and takes Vola into his arms, comforting and soothing her with a delicate speech describing the almost unbearable suffering of the first heartbreak. In the meantime, the viewer is branded with a languorous camera choreography orbiting the two youths, moodily lit by the dim road lights hovering above them, in a fashion much typical of Angelopoulos' practice, of which the audience will find similar echoing in Voyage to CYTHERA or The Hunters. In the end, Orestes lets them go as they proceed into the darkness, waving goodbye to them, and the scene can be taken as another life lesson for Vola and Alexandros, this time concerning the subject of letting go of one's possessions or emotional locus, on understanding the suffering stemming from loss as inevitable, and that relinquishing one's attachments may prove incredibly difficult but may sometimes be necessary, even against our will, and that such events will occur more than once during our lives, so that we must be prepared to meet with unsavory and unchangeable circumstances, which nevertheless do not define ourselves, nor our lives and our future. As the bridge and support for Vola and Alexandros' candid bubble, Orestes' role turns him into a figure of the utmost importance in the film, as we have seen, but aside from those circumstances, he acquires particular relevance for another reason as well. He effectively introduces another meta-aspect to the work mentioned briefly and earlier in this series by attracting the troupe from one of Angelopoulos' previous films and a phenomenal masterwork on its own, The Traveling Players. Whilst people unacquainted with the film will find the appearance of the band of actors a curious little circumstance among the various other events which Vola and Alexandros witnessed during their adventure, those who are lucky enough to have watched The Traveling Players will be amused to find the exact same people portraying their roles from a decade before. Much like the yellow coats mentioned earlier, the players here crystallize a connection between Angelopoulos' cinematic corpus, not merely acting as a quaint transversal narrative entity, but also symbolizing the ephemeral nature of past creations. The players, as of today, at least those that have managed to survive, have lost their status and have become unimportant, irrelevant indeed, an inconsequential subject in this contemporary time frame, hence portraying once again in subtle fashion the theme of impermanence and relative importance attributed to figures of yore. Like the hand that emerges from the harbor in Thessaloniki, they had glory and served a purpose at some point in time, but are now relics that, albeit deserving of recognition, bear no influence in today's affairs. They stand motionless in front of the sea, whereas in their previous cinematic incarnation were bound to remain in travel. They now conform to silence, whilst in their earlier film were condemned to speak and act. In a scene later in the film, the traveling players is once again evoked, when a white chicken at a waiting room in a train station seems to cause the observers to become transfixed for a moment, just before the animal is caught and taken away, afterwards bringing the typical bustle and noise back to the room. A scene much reminiscent of the episode where the players, consumed by hunger, find a chicken roaming in the snowy countryside and from their frostbitten stiffness then slowly move in to catch it. Talking with Dan Fainaro in 1999, Angelopoulos said that it was actually Tonino Guerra who had one day called him when the script for the film had been already finished and asserted very seriously that there should be a scene with a hen in the film. Despite not having an answer to where the hen should be placed in the film, he convinced the Greek director to add it, and in the end he acknowledged the Italian author's suggestion as a valuable inclusion. Regardless of the origin of this specific episode, like several noted novelists of the 20th century, such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez or William Faulkner for example, Angelopoulos occasionally infuses his work with cross-references, intersecting devices and illusions, not subtracting in appreciation from the work in any way for those unaware, but undoubtedly exponentially developing the pleasure a viewer acquainted with his work and thought gets, for he not only inserts these as references, but uses them to emphasize even further some of the points made across in alternate elements in the same film. For an audience already familiar and with a fondness for his artistic output, his filmmaking style and thematic interests, aesthetics and pace, Landscape in a Mist is an instantly gratifying cinematic experience, for it coalesces all the strengths that have made him an iconic director. Yet, for the unexpected first-time viewer, perhaps his meditative style might initially be the cause of concern or annoyance. One must acknowledge first of all that, for Angelopoulos, the relationship between the camera, the actor and the landscape makes up for an almost sacred bind, akin to the Holy Trinity, in a sense that all three of them share a common essence, and that despite their tripartite allotment, it is through the conjoining of all that one is able to partake of the wholeness of the film object. Bearing that in mind, it is no surprise that Angelopoulos comes across as someone whose style is unusually rigorous and manifesting an individuality that proudly clashes with traditional traits of film creation. Famed Japanese director Akira Kurosawa has said once that Angelopoulos watches things calmly through the lens. It is the weight of his calm and the sharpness of his unmoving regard that gives his films their power. And the purpose for that has been stated by Angelopoulos himself when he said that he hoped his films would allow for a new kind of audience to emerge. Not just a consumer who uses only his emotions, but a person that also uses his mind. By carefully picking and composing his images, labored pictures who are granted the space and time to embody a meaning that overcomes the confined borders of literality and triviality, Angelopoulos is yielding those representations with the power to speak for themselves, whilst making no effort to occlude the anxiety surging between the material and the immaterial, some would say spiritual or transcendental, aspects of the image, which have been addressed in the previous video. The friction deriving from that palpable tension is bound to produce a spark which will hopefully ignite the spectator's mental operation and awaken him from his passive cinematic slumber. It then becomes rather clear that Angelopoulos has no interest in solely depicting a series of events for the spectator to detachedly consume in his thirst for distraction in a shallow pursuit of time spending with no personal involvement. Indeed, as viewers, we are invited to take the role of fellow companions and fellow voyagers, and in the end, as fellow artists and creators, co-authoring the complete work that is able to reach the totality only with our dedication and input. Having slowed us down to the rhythm of life itself and resorting to as few cinematic tricks as possible, whilst simultaneously resisting the attempt to provide the entirety of the puzzle pieces, as reflected in the way certain words, thoughts and feelings are held intimately, even if with a throbbing physical side effect or manifestation, has the inevitable outcome of granting the possibility for the spectator to assemble the full work by himself from both an emotional and intellectual point of view. In his book, The Films of Angelopoulos, A Cinema of Contemplation, Andrew Horton gives the example of the scene in which Vola and Alexandros are walking in a highway up in the north of the country, and how one is absorbed by the scene's minimalistic action and setting, two children simply walking a vast and dark landscape without speaking to one another and with barely any action besides their walking, which opens up the space for the viewer to contemplate and meditate on the lives of those two characters, wondering what are they feeling, What brought them there? Where are they going? What do they desire? Will they reach their destination? A few amongst the plethora of questions that surge and induce the viewer to involve with the work and its figures, thereby disclosing the interactive character of the film intrinsic to such a particular aesthetic framework, one that has been thoroughly absent from less than mindful and plainly commodified filmmaking. This meditative approach to filmmaking, characteristic of Angelopoulos, is obviously encased in his stylistic trademark, one in which the sequence shot arises as the main protagonist and basic, foundational element through which all other elements such as the narrative ellipses, inexpressiveness, depth of space, still moments, or the accentuation of off-screen space, which David Bordwell has so precisely pointed out, are made possible to organically operate. The description and dynamic of the sequence shot has also been addressed in an earlier video, which features an extensive discussion of a shot in Angelopoulos' 1991 film The Suspended Step of the Stork, so head over to that video if the subject interests you. In any case, by having the stories and myths of his narrative undergirded by this reflective cinematic device, Angelopoulos establishes a framework in which meaning and interpretation of the presented subjects and events becomes a second nature for an audience deeply immersed in a plot, even whilst refraining from advancing with definitive conclusions throughout, an aspect which finds an echo in Gilles Deleuze's distinction between image recollection and pure recollection, as pointed out by Richard Rushton's essay in the book The Cinema of Theo Angelopoulos. Image recollection is characterized by a knowledge of the past that may be stored and used in the future, while pure recollection is exemplified by the spectacle, bewilderment and confusion that begs the question, what is that, and which leaves as the only possibility the willingness to look back, to try to make connections and to delve into one's memory. In one interview, Angelopoulos said that in contrast to films where the viewer is left with the impression of having learned all there is to know about the physical aspect of persons on screen without anything left to discover, in Landscape in the Mist he aimed to preserve the delight and wonder of an initial discovery, and this he precisely succeeds, much due to his meditative style supported and carried through the sequence shot. At the end of the day, Angelopoulos offers no simple solutions nor quick lessons for everyday life, but his films demonstrate a recurring concern not only with history, but especially with how it affects people's notion of freedom and tradition, belief and legitimacy, hinting at a progressive attitude, tolerant viewpoint that allows for temporal, social, emotional, and geographical dialogue for the sake of a dignified, liberated existence for everyone, regardless of their origin, skin color, language, or creed. Therein lies much of the captivating power that draws assorted viewers towards the Greek director's art, the mystery and magic that subtly mesmerizes us, as well as the dreamlike beauty derived therefrom, and from a different perspective, the incompleteness that entices us to fulfill the blank spots through our own psychological effort. In the continuation of this series, the cinematic wizardry and wonder that is evoked on Landscape in the Mist shall be delved into, with more meaningful episodes of the film probed and comprehensively examined, together with expositions on how Angelopoulos crafted and perceived the film as a fairy tale. Make sure to check part 1 of this series if you haven't already, and try to explore other Angelopoulos' films, as an acquaintance with his extensive output will benefit the readings of Landscape in the Mist. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.